He rode back expecting a grave. What he found was a life someone else had built on his bones. For 5 years, Wyatt Mercer ran from the land that swallowed his family whole, and now a courthouse notice said he had 30 days before it belonged to a stranger. He expected ash and silence. He expected rust and rot, and the particular kind of emptiness that confirms a man's worst suspicions about himself. What he found instead was smoke rising from a chimney, laundry on a line, and a woman who had turned his ruin into something worth living for. And he hadn't told her a single word of the truth. If this story pulls you in from the first line, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this ride takes us. The notice came on a Tuesday, folded twice inside a cracked leather envelope that had passed through 4 different post offices before catching up with Wyatt Mercer in the back corner of a roadhouse in Dalton Creek, New Mexico. He'd been nursing a cup of coffee gone cold and watching rain drag itself sideways across the window glass when the barkeep set the envelope on the table without a word. Wyatt didn't open it right away. He had a particular wariness about paper, about anything official that came searching for him specifically. So he let it sit there for a while, ordered another coffee he didn't drink, and eventually unfolded it under the low light of a kerosene lamp. Final notice of tax delinquency and scheduled auction. Mercer Homestead, Harlan County, Colorado Territory. He read it twice. Then he set it down and stared at the window. The rain hadn't let up. He'd left the Mercer Ranch 5 years ago with nothing but his horse and the clothes on his back, riding out before dawn so he wouldn't have to see the faces of the people who'd come to help him bury what was left. He told himself he would go back. Men tell themselves all kinds of things when grief is fresh enough to believe them. But 5 years had a way of rearranging the landscape of intention, and somewhere between Wyoming and Arizona, between the jobs that paid and the ones that didn't, between the nights that passed and the nights that wouldn't, the promise he'd made to himself had quietly dissolved. He thought about the ranch the way a man thinks about a tooth that's been pulled, the space where something used to be, a hollow he'd learned to eat around. Now the courthouse was telling him the space was about to be filled by whoever showed up with the right amount of money. Wyatt folded the notice into his coat pocket, paid for the coffee he hadn't touched, and walked out into the rain. Well, he left Dalton Creek the next morning. It was a 10-day ride to Harlan County if you didn't push too hard, and the mountain passes were cooperative, which they weren't. Early October in the Colorado high country was a crapshoot. You could get blue skies and cold, clean air, or you could get 3 inches of overnight snow that turned trail mud into something closer to wet concrete. Wyatt got both, alternating, neither one consistent enough to plan around. His horse, a bay gelding named Trouble. Because naming a horse something optimistic had always struck him as tempting the wrong kind of fate, handled the elevation better than Wyatt did. Wyatt's left knee had never properly recovered from a fall outside of Cheyenne 2 winters back, and the cold settled into it like a permanent tenant by day 3 of the ride. He slept under lean-tos and open sky in roughly equal measure. He ate what he carried and supplemented it with creek water and 2 rabbits he took on day 5 with a patience he didn't entirely feel. He didn't talk to anyone, which suited him fine. Wyatt had never been a man who needed conversation to fill silence, and after 5 years of moving from place to place on the far edge of other people's lives, solitude had become something close to a physical condition. Not comfortable, exactly, but familiar in the way that old pain is familiar. He tried not to think about what he was riding toward. He wasn't entirely successful. The ranch sat at the end of a dirt track that cut off the main road about 2 miles past the old Harlan County survey marker, a limestone post half swallowed by scrub oak that Wyatt recognized before he consciously expected to. The familiarity of it hit him low and sideways, the way certain memories do when they've been packed away long enough to lose their warning. He pulled Trouble to a stop at the survey marker and sat for a moment. The track ahead was overgrown at the edges, but clearly traveled. That registered as odd. He'd expected the full weight of abandonment, high grass taking the road back, fence posts rotted to stumps. Maybe the remains of the front gate collapsed on itself. He'd built an entire picture in his mind over the course of 10 days of riding, a detailed portrait of ruin that would match the ruin he carried inside him, and he'd been almost comfortable with it. Instead, the track was worn. Wheel ruts. Recent ones. He nudged Trouble forward. The change came gradually, the way light changes when you ride out of tree cover. Incrementally, then all at once. The fencing along the northern pasture had been replaced at some point. New posts driven in clean barbed wire strung tight and level. The pasture itself held a small herd of cattle, 8, maybe 10 head, grazing the dried October grass with the unhurried focus of animals that had learned to trust their ground. A kitchen garden stretched along the eastern side of the house, mostly harvested now, bean poles still standing, pumpkins fat and orange along the near row. The house itself had been repaired. That was the part that stopped him completely. He remembered leaving it with a section of the front porch sagging, 2 windows boarded after the glass broke in a winter storm, the whole structure carrying the exhausted lean of a building that had stopped being tended. Someone had rebuilt the porch. The boards were newer than the rest of the structure, visibly different in color, but the work was solid, the kind of solid that comes from someone who learned carpentry out of necessity rather than training. The windows had glass. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Wyatt sat on Trouble at the edge of the yard and stared at the house his family had built and that he had left to the mercy of time, and he felt something turn over slowly in his chest, something he couldn't immediately name because it was made of too many different things pressed together. He was still working out what to do about that when the front door opened. The woman who came out onto the porch was carrying a bucket. She was somewhere in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. It was hard to tell at distance, harder still, because she moved like someone who'd spent years learning to do everything efficiently, with the kind of economy that comes not from training, but from the daily mathematics of survival. Dark hair pulled back at the neck, work dress covered by an apron that had been patched twice that he could see, boots that were practical and worn. She set the bucket down on the porch railing, shaded her eyes with one hand, and looked directly at him. She didn't look frightened. She looked measuring. "You lost?" she called. "No, ma'am," Wyatt said. He moved Trouble forward a few steps into the yard. "I'm not sure what I am exactly, but I'm not lost." The woman's eyes moved over him with the frank, unhurried assessment of someone who'd learned to read strangers quickly and trust the reading. He probably looked exactly like what he was. A road-worn man on a tired horse, carrying the particular dust of long-distance travel and not much else. "This is private property," she said. "Not hostile, just a statement of fact." "Yes, ma'am, I know it." He stopped Trouble at a polite distance, close enough for conversation, far enough to signal no immediate intention. "I'm Wyatt Mercer." He watched her face for recognition. He didn't see any. "Abigail Hart," she said. She picked the bucket back up, like the introduction was the end of it. "I used to know this land pretty well," he said. "Passed through this county years back. Was hoping I might water my horse and maybe pay for a meal, if you're amenable. I can work for it." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Trouble, who was showing visible signs of fatigue, head down, neck damp, one hind leg cocked in a posture that communicated exhaustion in the universal language of horses. "That horse needs more than water," she said. "He needs to stand for a few days. He's tougher than he looks." "He's not," she said flatly. "That's a sore left hind. Can't see it yet, but you'll see it by morning." She set the bucket on the ground at the base of the porch steps. "There's a trough around the side. Put him in the small corral and I'll look at the leg. Supper's at 6. You can sleep in the barn if you're not particular." Wyatt opened his mouth and closed it again. "I'm not particular," he said. "Didn't think so." She picked up the bucket and went back inside. "Whoa." He unsaddled Trouble and led him to the corral, running his hand along the horse's neck while he walked, feeling the dried sweat and the heat still radiating off his back. She'd been right about the leg. He could feel the slight hitch in Trouble's gait that he'd told himself for 2 days was nothing. He told himself that because he'd needed to get here, and admitting the horse was hurting would have forced him to slow down, and slowing down would have given him more time alone with his thoughts than he'd wanted. He got Trouble settled and walked a slow circuit around the outside of the ranch. It was stranger than he'd expected being back. He'd built up the return in his imagination as something large and heavy, a confrontation with memory, a reckoning that would require all of him. What he hadn't accounted for was that the ranch he'd left and the ranch he was walking now were 2 substantially different places, and the dissonance of that was its own particular kind of difficult. The barn had new roof planking on the western slope. The tool shed had been rebuilt from the frame up, by the look of it. The kitchen garden was laid out differently than he remembered. Smarter, actually, better oriented to catch the afternoon sun. A small hen house sat against the south fence where there'd been nothing before. Whoever this woman was, Abigail Hart, she hadn't just maintained the place. She had improved it, methodically, practically, intelligently, with the limited resources of someone working alone. He was standing at the fence of the south pasture looking out at the cattle when he heard the fast, light sound of small boots on dirt. He turned. The girl was maybe 6 years old, maybe 7, small for her age, or maybe just built compact, with her mother's dark hair and eyes that took in the world with the direct, fearless curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to be wary of strangers. She was carrying a slightly battered rag doll with one arm missing and wearing a coat that was too large for her by at least 2 sizes. She stopped about 4 feet from him and looked him up and down with complete frankness. "You're the man with the tired horse," she said. "I am," Wyatt said. "Wyatt Mercer." "Molly Hart." She offered her small hand with the gravity of someone who'd been taught that handshakes were serious business. He shook it carefully. "Is your horse going to be okay?" "Your mama thinks so. I expect she's right." Molly nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already suspected about her mother's general reliability. "She's usually right about animals," she said. "She fixed a crow once. It had a broken wing. She put a little splint on it out of a twig and some string. Did it fly again?" "Eventually." Molly paused. "It kept coming back after that. Mama said it was just looking for more food, but I think it remembered." Wyatt looked at her. "I think you might be right," he said. She seemed satisfied with this. "Supper's almost ready," she said. "Mama said to tell you if I saw you." "Thank you, Miss Molly." She turned and ran back toward the house with the complete abandon of a child who has somewhere to be, her too large coat flapping, her rag doll bouncing at her side. Wyatt watched her go. Then he looked at the house, the smoke from the chimney, the light beginning to glow warm in the windows as the sun dropped behind the western ridge. He stood there a minute longer than he should have. Abigail Hart ran, a clean kitchen, and a spare table. Supper was salt pork, boiled potatoes, green beans from the last of the garden, and cornbread that was still warm. She set 3 places without ceremony and didn't ask questions during the meal, which Wyatt appreciated more than he could have expressed, because questions during meals were the kind of social transaction that required a person to decide how honest they were willing to be. And he wasn't ready for that calculation yet. Molly asked enough questions for everyone, which both filled the silence and provided him cover. She wanted to know where he'd ridden from, what the weather was like in New Mexico, whether he'd ever seen a real buffalo, whether he thought crows were smarter than horses, whether he'd been to Denver, whether Denver was as big as people said. He answered all of it honestly and briefly, and she received each answer with the focused attention of someone filing information for future use. Abigail watched this with a guarded expression that wasn't quite warmth and wasn't quite suspicion, somewhere in the careful middle of both. After Molly had been sent to bed with minimal successful resistance, Abigail sat across the table from him with her coffee cup and the particular quality of quiet that settles over a house once a child is finally down. The kerosene lamp was low. The fire in the stove had burned to a steady heat. "How long since you passed through this county?" she said. He'd been expecting the question. He'd been thinking since the corral about how to answer it, and what he'd landed on was a version of the truth that was technically accurate and practically incomplete. "Been a while," he said. "Place has changed." "It's changed because someone worked it," she said. There was no particular pride in it, just the same flat factual tone she'd used to tell him the horse had a sore leg. Took about 3 years before it started feeling like something solid. "Where'd you come from before?" "Kansas," she said. "Before that, Missouri." She turned the coffee cup between her palms. "Molly's father went ahead to scout land out west. Sent one letter saying he'd found something promising. After that, nothing." Wyatt looked at the table. "I'm sorry. People disappear," Abigail said. "Sometimes it's deliberate, and sometimes it isn't. Either way, you end up in the same place." She said it with the matter-of-fact steadiness of someone who'd worked through bitterness a long time ago and come out the other side into something more durable. "I had $50, a wagon, a horse, and a daughter who'd just turned 3. Someone in town mentioned there was an abandoned homestead up the North Track that hadn't been claimed in a couple of years. Said the tax hadn't been paid, that the county was likely to auction it but hadn't gotten around to it yet." Wyatt felt something tighten behind his sternum. "So you came up the track," he said. "I came up the track," she said. "Found the house empty. Porch was half rotted, windows out, but the frame was sound and the well was good. I stayed the first night because I didn't have anywhere else to go. And then I stayed the second night for the same reason, and after a while staying became the plan." She looked at him with those measuring eyes. "You said you used to know this land." "I said that," he agreed. You know who owned it? The fire in the stove ticked. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek with a low sound like breathing. It was in a family a long time, Wyatt said carefully. I don't know what the current situation is with the county records. The lie was accurate in structure and hollow in intent, and he felt the hollowness of it sitting in his chest like a stone he'd swallowed and couldn't seem to dislodge. I'd have to look into it. Abigail studied him for a moment. Then she looked at her coffee. Town says the auction's coming, she said. Elspeth Crawford at the general store told me last month. She seemed to think I should know, so I'd have time to arrange things. A brief, compressed pause. Arrange things. Like 5 years of work just arranges itself into a bundle you can carry somewhere else. What does the county say? The county says the taxes owe more than I have. She said it without flinching. I've been trying to get ahead of it, but there's not a lot of margin out here. Every time I get a little ahead, the roof needs fixing, or a calf gets sick, or the winter runs longer than expected. She looked up at him. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand what this place is and isn't. What is it? It's mine, she said simply. In every way that actually matters. I built it. I stayed through the winters nobody thought I'd stay through. That's mine, whatever a piece of paper says. Wyatt looked at her across the low light of the table. He thought about the notice in his coat pocket, the one that said Final Notice, Scheduled Auction. I thought about the fact that the auction had been triggered specifically because he, the legal owner, the absent, grieving, running owner, had not paid taxes in 5 years. He thought about telling her right then, about pulling the notice out and laying it flat on the table between the coffee cups and the cornbread plate and saying, I'm Wyatt Mercer, and this land is mine by deed, and I have 30 days to settle the taxes before the county sells it out from under both of us. He thought about the way her face would change when he did. You should get some sleep, he said instead. Long day. She looked at him for one moment longer than comfortable. Barn's clean, she said. There's extra blankets on the shelf by the door. She picked up the coffee cups and turned toward the wash basin, and Wyatt sat at her table in the house he'd been born in and listened to the cottonwoods move in the dark outside, and hated himself with a particular precision that only comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and doing it anyway. He woke in the barn before dawn with the cold of early October sitting on the back of his neck and the smell of hay and horses around him, and the immediate disorienting certainty of exactly where he was. Trouble shifted in his stall. The bay's breathing was even, which was something. Wyatt lay in the dark with his hands behind his head and looked up at the roof planking he didn't recognize and thought about what he was doing. He'd come back to pay the taxes. That was the plan in its entirety. Come back, settle the account, sign whatever the county needed signed, and then he hadn't worked out the then. The plan had always been thin at the far end because the far end required him to decide what happened to the land after he'd saved it, and that question had too many chambers in it, each one leading to another question he didn't want to stand in. He hadn't planned for Abigail Hart. He hadn't planned for the fences she'd rebuilt, and the cattle she'd bought, and the kitchen garden laid out to catch the afternoon sun. He hadn't planned for a 6-year-old who thought crows remembered kindness and shook hands like it was important. He hadn't planned for a woman who'd looked him in the face across a table lit by one lamp and said it's mine, in the tone of someone stating a fact that the universe was welcome to try to argue with. He hadn't planned to lie to her, but he had, and he'd go on lying until he figured out how to stop. He got up before the house stirred and went to check on Trouble. The left hind leg was puffy at the fetlock, exactly as she'd predicted. He stood in the stall running his hand down the horse's leg and thinking that if she was right about Trouble needing several days of rest, and she was, clearly, then he wasn't riding out tomorrow, or the day after, which meant he was staying, which meant he had days instead of hours before the truth caught up with him. He didn't know if that was better or worse. He'd learned over 5 years of running that having more time to think was not always the gift it presented itself as. Sometimes more time just meant more opportunity to talk yourself into choices you already knew were wrong. He heard the house door open, then the sound of boots on the new porch boards, then the particular combination of those sounds that told him it was a child rather than an adult, the lightness of it, the inconsistency of rhythm. Molly appeared at the barn door in the gray pre-dawn, her coat buttoned wrong, her rag doll tucked under one arm. "Mama says breakfast is in an hour," she said, "but I thought you might want company in the meantime." Wyatt looked at her. "Come in then," he said. "Just don't touch anything on the left wall. That's where your mama keeps the sharp tools. She came in with the careful deliberateness of a child who has been told about sharp tools before and takes the information seriously. She found an overturned bucket near Trouble's stall and sat on it without being asked, pulling her coat tighter. What happened to his leg? She said. Long ride, Wyatt said. Nothing that won't fix itself with rest. How long will you stay? He looked at Trouble, at the puffy fetlock, at the particular way the horse was holding his weight. Few days, he said. Maybe a little longer. Molly seemed to be working something out. You knew this land before, she said. It wasn't quite a question. What makes you say that? The way you look at things, she said, like you're remembering them instead of seeing them for the first time. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. The barn was filling slowly with the gray light of early morning, and somewhere outside the cottonwoods were still moving in a wind that had come down from the high country cold and steady. You're sharp, he said. Mama says observation is a skill, Molly said. She says most people don't practice it. She's right. He moved to the water bucket and checked it, full, which meant Abigail had been out here earlier this morning before either of them. Your mama works hard. She works all the time, Molly said. Sometimes I think she's afraid to stop. She said this with the unsentimental clarity of a child who doesn't yet know that some observations are too accurate for comfort. Like if she stops moving, something bad will catch up. Wyatt stood very still for a moment. Yeah, he said. I know that feeling. Molly looked at him over the head of her rag doll with eyes that were older than her face. Are you running from something too? He thought about the notice in his coat pocket, about the family he'd buried in the spring mud of a terrible year and then ridden away from because staying had been more than he could bear, about the 5 years he'd spent making himself useful enough in enough places to avoid being anywhere long enough to feel the weight of what he'd left behind. I'm trying to figure that out, he said honestly. She seemed to accept this. She shifted on her bucket and looked at Trouble. I think he's glad to be resting, she said. I think so too, Wyatt said. Outside, the sun was beginning to clear the eastern ridge, and the first light was crossing the yard in long, thin lines between the fence posts, laying itself across the frost-hardened ground. From the house came the sound of the stove being stoked, the particular clatter of a morning starting up, the sound of a household with its own rhythms, its own weight, its own accumulated life. Wyatt had not heard that sound in 5 years. He stood in the barn doorway and let it reach him, and did not look away. Chuck, that first full day on the ranch was disorienting in the specific way of things that feel wrong and right at the same time, in proportions he couldn't separate. Abigail put him to work without ceremony or extended discussion, which he suspected was part calculation and part simply her nature. A woman who had operated alone long enough that she'd lost patience for the extended negotiations of how things ought to be done. The north fence needed a section replaced. He replaced it. The woodpile at the side of the house was low. He split wood until it wasn't. There was a loose hinge on the barn door that had been improvised into function with a piece of wire she hadn't had time to fix properly. He fixed it properly. She watched him work the way she'd assessed him at the gate, directly, with the unsentimental eye of someone evaluating competence rather than character. He had the sense that character would come later, if it came at all, and that it would be determined by the accumulated evidence of days rather than the impression of a conversation. In the early afternoon, she came out of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without preamble, and they stood at the fence looking out at the north pasture. You know ranching, she said. Grew up with it. Where? Colorado, he said. Which was true. She looked at him sideways. You're not going to tell me which part. Not yet, he said. A pause. Not yet implies eventually. Maybe, he said. She drank her coffee and looked at the pasture. The cattle are a small herd, but they've been healthy. I lost a heifer 2 winters ago to a hard freeze, and a calf this past spring to a difficult birth. But the rest have been solid. I've been trying to build the herd slowly rather than taking on more than I can manage alone. Smart, he said. Necessary. She turned the cup. There's a bull 3 ranches east that a man named Grover will lend out for a reasonable fee. I'm hoping to get 2 more heifers bred by spring. If the auction... She stopped. He waited. If things stay uncertain, she said, choosing her words with care. I don't know if it makes sense to plan that far. But if I stop planning because things might fall apart, then things definitely fall apart. So I keep planning. Wyatt looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she held the coffee cup with both hands, the particular stillness of a person who has learned to inhabit difficulty without collapsing under it. That's not a bad philosophy, he said. It's not a philosophy, she said. It's just the only option I found that works. He almost told her then. The words were right there, organized and waiting. I need to tell you something about this property, about my name, about why I came back. He could feel them lined up behind his teeth. Then Molly came running across the yard with something cupped in both hands and a look of urgent import on her face, and the moment dissolved. Mama, there's a frog by the creek, and it's enormous, and I think it might be special. Abigail turned from the fence with an expression that shifted completely in under a second, from guarded and practical to something that was unmistakably love, messy and immediate and impossible to manage. Show me, she said. Molly grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the creek at a pace that brooked no adult deliberateness, and Wyatt watched them go. The woman who had built a life from his abandoned grief running through the October dry grass toward a frog that might be special. And he stood at the fence holding his coffee cup, and felt something inside him shift on a hinge that had rusted shut a long time ago. He didn't know yet what that meant, but he stood there and let it happen, in the thin bright light of a Colorado afternoon, on the land that was his by deed and hers by everything else that counted. And he understood, in the particular way that men understand things they haven't earned the right to yet, that there was no version of the truth ahead that was going to be easy. Not one. The frog turned out to be ordinary, brown-speckled, palm-sized, unbothered by the attention it was receiving. But Molly held it with the reverence of someone handling something rare, and Abigail crouched beside her in the dead grass at the creek's edge, and looked at it with the same focused consideration she gave everything her daughter brought her. Not performed interest, actual interest, or something close enough that the difference didn't matter. Wyatt watched from a distance he hadn't consciously chosen, standing back at the fence with his empty coffee cup, and told himself he was giving them privacy. That was probably half true. The other half was that he didn't quite know how to be close to it. That particular tableau of a mother and her daughter at the edge of a creek in the October light, uncomplicated and alive in a way that made the last 5 years of his life feel like a long time to have been nowhere. I went back to splitting wood before either of them turned around. By supper, he'd restacked the woodpile twice, repaired the barn door hinge properly, and found a section of drainage ditch along the east field that was partially blocked with silt and debris. He didn't have time to clear it before the light went, so he marked it in his mind for morning and came in when Abigail called. She'd made a beef stew from what he guessed was the last of a stored shank, stretched with root vegetables and thickened with a roux, that was slightly darker than ideal, but compensated with flavor. She set the pot in the center of the table and they ate without formality, Molly narrating a complex ongoing dispute between two of the barn cats with the narrative momentum of someone who'd been saving the story all day. Abigail listened and ate and occasionally corrected details. That was last Thursday, not yesterday, without breaking Molly's rhythm. Wyatt watched them and ate his stew and thought about the drainage ditch. He was deliberately thinking about the drainage ditch. Trouble's fetlock was still swollen on the second morning, less than the first, but not enough to ride on. Not on mountain terrain, not on a horse that had already been pushed harder than he should have been. Wyatt stood in the stall with his hand on the leg, and accepted this with the practiced equanimity of a man who'd learned that fighting the facts of a situation costs more than it produces. He was staying. At least a few more days. He went and told Abigail, who was at the kitchen garden pulling the last of the dry bean plants. I figured, she said, without looking up from the plants. I'll keep working for my keep, he said. I know you will, she said. That drainage ditch on the east field needs clearing. I've been meaning to get to it for a month. He nodded. There's also a section of the south pasture fence that's been worrying me, she said. Third post from the creek bend. It's leaning. It'll go in the first hard wind. I'll look at it. She finally looked up at him, one hand full of dead bean stalks, squinting slightly against the thin morning sun. You work like someone who knows what needs doing before they're told, she said. I've worked ranches, he said. Most men who've worked ranches know how to do things, she said. Fewer know what order to do them in. She pulled another plant. It's different. He didn't have an answer for that didn't lead somewhere he wasn't ready to go. I'll start with the ditch, he said. The ditch took most of the morning. It was worse than it had looked from the edge, a section about 12 feet long where accumulated silt, dead grass, and a tangle of willow roots had reduced the channel to a narrow trickle that was backing water up into the low corner of the east field. Another hard rain, and that corner would flood, which in late October, with the ground already cooling, could freeze and heave the fence posts out of true. He dug it out by hand with a spade, working methodically from the blocked section outward, piling the spoil on the uphill side. It was hard, wet, cold work that made his knee complain steadily, and his back remind him of several things he'd done in his 30s that his body had apparently decided to bill him for retroactively. He was midway through the clearing when he heard boots on the frozen ground and looked up to find Abigail standing at the edge of the ditch with a second spade. "You don't need to," he started. "I'm aware," she said, and stepped into the ditch. They worked in silence for a while, not the uncomfortable silence of two people avoiding something, but the particular functional silence of shared physical work, where the coordination of effort becomes its own language. She was strong, and she was efficient, and she did not make a production of either, which he respected. After a while she said, "You were going to say you had it handled." "I did have it handled." "You had half of it handled," she said. "The hard half is the root mass on the uphill end." He looked at the root mass on the uphill end. She was right. "I was getting there," he said. She made a sound that wasn't quite agreement. They went back to work. By noon the ditch was clear and running properly, carrying a thin, cold stream of water down toward the creek in a way that would redirect the next rainfall away from the low field corner. They climbed out and stood on the bank looking at it for a moment, in the way that people look at things they've fixed. Not with pride exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a problem that no longer exists. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "You cleared the hard end." "I know," she said. "I'm thanking you for the half you did." He looked at her. She looked at the ditch. "You hungry?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Come in then." Lunch was cornbread left from breakfast and cold beans from the pot, eaten standing at the kitchen counter because neither of them had thought to sit down. Molly was at the table with a small chalk slate, writing letters in the laborious, concentrated way of a child who is learning that the connection between knowing something and being able to put it on paper is not automatic. "She's teaching herself to read," Abigail said quietly, half under her breath, like she still found it slightly remarkable. "Mostly," Molly said, without looking up. She'd clearly heard. "Mama helps with the hard letters." "Which are the hard letters?" Wyatt asked. Molly looked up from the slate. "Q," she said, with the gravity of a long-standing grievance. "Q makes no sense." "Q is Q's own problem," Wyatt said. "Don't take it personally." Molly considered this, wrote something on the slate, and went back to work with slightly more force than before. Abigail caught Wyatt's eye across the counter. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but the beginning of an opening, the way a door shifts in its frame before it actually moves. She looked away first. "She hasn't had much in the way of schooling," Abigail said. "There's no schoolhouse closer than 4 miles. I've been teaching her what I know. It's not—" She stopped, pulled at the edge of the cornbread. "It's not everything she should have." "She's sharp," Wyatt said. "That counts for more than a schoolhouse." "It counts for something," Abigail said. "Not everything." There was a weight in it that told him the schooling was just the surface of a longer thought, one about Molly having less than she deserved because of choices and circumstances that Abigail ran through on a regular basis, probably late at night when there was no one to talk her out of it. He knew that particular late-night arithmetic. He'd done it himself for different losses. "She'll be okay," he said. Abigail looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I don't," he said. "But she's observant, and she thinks for herself, and she shakes hands like it matters. That's not nothing." A pause. "No," Abigail said. "It's not nothing." The town of Harlan was 4 miles south on the main road, and on the 4th day after Wyatt's arrival, Abigail loaded the wagon to make a supply run. She asked him, without particular ceremony, whether he'd stay with Molly. He said yes before he fully thought about it, and then she was gone down the track in the wagon with a list in her pocket, and he was standing in the yard with a 6-year-old and 4 hours to fill. Molly, it turned out, had a specific agenda. "I want to show you the old house," she said. He went very still. "What old house?" She pointed southeast, toward the far edge of the property, where the land dipped into a shallow ravine lined with old cottonwoods. "There's a burned house down in the trees. Mama says it burned a long time ago, and we don't go down there." "Then we shouldn't go down there," he said. "I know," she said. "I don't want to go in it. I just know it's there. Sometimes I think about who lived in it." She looked up at him with those direct eyes. Do you know? The morning was cold and still, the sky that particular pale blue of high-altitude autumn that looks clean and remote at the same time. I might, he said carefully. Who? He was quiet for a moment. A family, he said. A long time ago. What happened to them? He looked southeast toward the cottonwoods he couldn't see from here, but that he could find in the dark if he had to, purely by the way the land lay. Hard winter, he said. Things went wrong. Molly sat with this. That's sad, she said. Yes, he said. Do you think they'd mind that we're here, in their house? He thought about that question longer than a simple question warranted. Thought about the people it was really asking about what they'd been. A woman who'd laughed too loud at her own jokes and kept the kitchen warmer than it needed to be because she hated the cold. A boy who'd been 7 years old and had his mother's laugh and his father's stubbornness, and who'd been just beginning to understand that a horse was a partnership rather than a tool. No, he said. His voice came out steady. I don't think they'd mind at all. Molly nodded, satisfied. Good, she said. I talk to them sometimes. At night, if I can't sleep. I don't know their names, so I just say hello to whoever's listening. Wyatt looked at her. That's a kind thing to do, he said. She shrugged with the modesty of someone who hadn't considered it might be notable. Mama says this land has memory, she said. I think she means we should be respectful of what happened here before us, even if we don't know exactly what it was. He didn't answer right away. The cottonwoods along the creek were moving in a light wind, their bare branches clicking together with a dry, patient sound. Your mama's right, he said. Abigail came back from town with flour, salt, lamp oil, a new pair of gloves for Molly that she'd clearly calculated carefully against whatever she had in her pocket, and the expression of someone who has absorbed something unpleasant and is managing it with effort. She didn't say anything at first. She unhitched the horse, put the supplies away, and started supper while Wyatt worked on the south fence post she'd mentioned, the leaning third post from the creek bend, which turned out to need not just retamping, but resetting entirely, the base having rotted just below the frost line. He was still working when she came out to the pasture at dusk and stood watching him for a minute. Elspeth Crawford at the store told me the auction date's been set, she said. 19 days. He kept working. He had to keep his hands on something, or he'd say what he wasn't ready to say. What's the tax amount? More than I have, she said. I asked at the county office when I was in town. They gave me a number. She said the number. He tamped the post. It was solid now. It would hold through the winter. That's not a small amount, he said. No, she said. It's not. She put her hands in her coat pockets. Elspeth also told me that Vern Calloway's been asking around about me. The name hit him the way cold water does, immediate and clarifying in a way that's the opposite of pleasant. He looked up at her. What kind of asking? The kind where a man's pretending to be curious but is actually gathering information, she said. He came through town last week. Elspeth says he's been talking to the county clerk, asking about the property, about who's been living here, about Molly. You know him? Her jaw set in a way that told him the answer before she gave it. He's the uncle of Molly's father, she said. Came around once 2 years ago. Tried to tell me I had no legal claim to anything because Thomas, Molly's father, had never formalized anything between us before he disappeared. Said Molly should come live with his people. Said the frontier was no place for a woman raising a child alone. She paused. I told him to get off my land. He left? He left, she said. But he had the look of a man who files things away for later. Wyatt put the tamping bar down and straightened up, his knee complaining about the crouch. He doesn't have any legal claim to Molly, he said. Not while I'm here and standing, she said. But if I lose this property, if I have nowhere to go, no means, a man like that could make arguments that get listened to in a county courthouse. She said it flatly, without drama, like she'd already turned the worst version of this around in her mind enough times that the shape of it was familiar. He's not stupid, Vern. He knows how to find a woman when she's lowest and push. The evening was going dark around them, the pasture turning from gold to gray, the cattle shifting in the far corner with their slow, collective patience. He's not going to get her, Wyatt said. Abigail looked at him. You don't know that, she said. I know it, he said. He met her eyes and held them, and he meant it in a way that he hadn't meant anything in a long time, in the way you mean things when you've finally found something specific to mean them about. She looked at him for a long time. Her expression was careful and complicated, and he couldn't read all of it. "You're an interesting man, Wyatt Mercer," she said finally. "I can't figure out what you're carrying." "Most men are carrying something," he said. "Most men drop it on the table and expect you to help them with it," she said. "You hold yours like you've decided nobody else should have to touch it." She turned and started back toward the house. "Supper's ready when you are." He stood in the dark pasture beside the fence post he'd set solid into the ground and listened to her boots on the frozen grass going away from him, and felt the weight of the notice in his coat pocket like a coal that had been glowing there for days, and knew, with the particular clarity that comes from running out of ways to avoid a thing, that the time for carrying it alone was running short. That night, after Molly was in bed and the stove had burned down to its steady heat, Abigail sat at the table with the ledger open in front of her, working numbers with a pencil stub in the way of someone looking for a combination that will open a lock they already know has no key. Wyatt sat across from her with coffee he wasn't drinking. "You want to tell me the numbers?" he said. She looked up. "You're not my banker." "No," he said, "but I might be able to think through it with you." A pause. Then she turned the ledger toward him. He looked at it for a while. The numbers were exactly what she'd said. Not catastrophic in isolation, but stacked on the reality of what a small ranch operation produces in a short season with one person running it, they were insurmountable. She'd been precise and careful in her record keeping. Every expenditure was noted, every income entered. It was the ledger of a woman who understood exactly where she stood at all times, which is sometimes the hardest way to be. "You've been breaking even," he said. "Some years," she said. "Last year I got a little ahead. This year the spring was wet and late. I lost 3 weeks of planting season, and the calf dying set me back on what I'd expected from the herd." "If the taxes were settled," he said, "what would you need to run this place through the winter?" She looked at him. "Why?" "I'm thinking through options." "They're not your options to think through," she said. Not harsh, just direct. "Humor me," he said. She looked at the ledger, then at him. Something moved behind her eyes. The calculation of whether this was a conversation worth having, whether the man across the table was the kind of person whose thinking she could trust, whether the risk of letting someone into the specifics of her situation was worth whatever came of it. "Through spring," she said slowly. "With the taxes settled, I could manage. The herd's solid. If I can get 2 heifers bred like I planned, the income next year should be enough to build some margin. I'd need to find a market for the cattle in the spring. There's a buyer in Fort Wells who's been reliable. And I'd need the fence on the north boundary reinforced before winter really sets in." She paused. "It's not impossible. Without the tax burden, it's actually close to viable." "It's not close to viable," he said. "It is viable." She looked at him with the expression of someone being told something they want to believe and aren't sure they're allowed to. "You don't know this land," she said. He looked at the ledger, at the kitchen around him, at the patched apron on the hook by the door, and the child's chalk slate on the shelf, and the window glass that someone had carefully replaced and glazed and sealed against the coming cold. "No," he said quietly. But the lie sat differently now. It sat like something that had been wearing away at its own foundation, and he could feel the ground shifting under it. He closed the ledger gently and slid it back across the table to her. "Get some sleep," he said. "The north fence will take 2 days if we start tomorrow." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she pulled the ledger to her side of the table and closed it herself. "You're still not telling me something," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not." She stood and took the ledger to the shelf where she kept it, and he sat at the table and listened to the sounds of the house settling around him in the cold. The tick of the stove, the shift of wood, the particular silence of a place that had been cared for enough to feel inhabited even when it was still. He'd had this. He'd had exactly this, in this house, in this kitchen, in this particular quality of evening, and then he'd lost it in one terrible spring and spent 5 years convincing himself the loss was the only true thing about him. Abigail Hart had walked onto his grief and built something real from it. Something with a ledger and a south fence post and a daughter who talked to the people in the burned house at night and a drainage ditch that ran clean now after a morning's work. He sat with that for a long time. The truth was not going to be kind when it came. He knew that. He had known it from the moment she'd told him it's mine across this same table, and he'd looked at the notice in his pocket and said nothing. But it was coming. He could feel it the way you feel weather in Colorado. Not the moment it arrives, but the pressure of it building in the hours before, certain and unavoidable and already, in some way, already here. The north fence took 2 days, as he'd said it would. The first day was harder than expected because the ground had already started its seasonal hardening, the frost working its way down through the soil an inch at a time, making every post hole an argument between the iron bar and the earth. Wyatt worked the bar while Abigail ran wire, and they moved along the fence line in a rhythm that had developed without discussion. Him driving and tamping, her unspooling and crimping, each reading the other's pace without having to ask. By the end of the second day, the north fence was solid. Wyatt's hands were raw, and his knee had filed a formal complaint that he ignored. And when he came in for supper, he moved slightly slower than usual, which Molly noticed and commented on with her characteristic directness. "You're walking like the old bull does when it's cold," she said. "That's accurate," Wyatt said. "Mama has a liniment for animals," Molly said helpfully. "She might use it on you." "I'm fine," he said. "The bull said the same thing," she said, and went back to her chalk slate. Abigail was at the stove and did not turn around, but he could see from the set of her shoulders that she was working to keep her expression where it was. He sat down carefully and did not mention the knee again. That night the temperature dropped hard, the kind of drop that announces the real arrival of winter, rather than its preliminary threats. By morning there was a thin crust of ice on the water trough, and frost on every surface the sun hadn't yet reached, and the cattle had bunched in the lee of the barn with the instinctive collective intelligence of animals that have been here before. Wyatt broke the ice on the trough and threw an extra measure of feed while Abigail checked the henhouse latch, which had a tendency to work itself loose in cold weather and needed a piece of wire twisted tight to hold it. They worked in the white early morning light side by side and didn't say much. That was the thing he hadn't expected, the silence between them. Not the tense, loaded silence of concealment, though that was also present, living in his chest like a splinter he'd stopped trying to remove. The other kind. The silence of two people who had found a working proximity, who moved through shared space without collision, whose daily rhythms had begun to fit together in the quiet, unremarkable way of a habit that forms before you've decided to form it. He hadn't had that with anyone in 5 years. He wasn't sure what to do with the fact that he had it now, in this situation, with this particular complication coiled at the center of it. After the morning chores, he went to the barn on the pretext of checking Trouble's leg, which was genuinely improving. The swelling nearly gone, the horse moving without the hitch that had marked the first days, and sat in the stall with his back against the wall and his boots in the straw, and held the notice in both hands. Final notice. Scheduled auction, Harlan County, 14 days remaining, by his count. He'd been here 9 days. He'd come to save the property from auction by settling the taxes and then… what? Right away? Let the county process grind forward with a different outcome? He hadn't thought it through, and the failure of that thinking was now sitting in front of him with the solid, immovable quality of a fence post set wrong. The kind of problem that gets worse the longer you leave it and doesn't fix itself no matter how long you wait. He could pay the taxes. He had enough. Barely, scraped from 5 years of work and stored in a bank in Pueblo because he'd never had a reason to spend it on anything that mattered. He could ride into the county seat, settle the account, and stop the auction. What happened after that was the part he couldn't resolve. If he paid the taxes, the property stayed in his name. He would need to tell Abigail why. There was no version of paying the county taxes on a property she believed was abandoned, in which he didn't explain who he was and what he held. And the moment he did that, everything she'd built, not the fence posts and the garden and the repaired porch, but the certainty she carried about this being hers, the solid ground of that, would shift under her in a way he'd put there deliberately by waiting this long. He'd had a dozen moments to tell her. At the supper table on the first night, in the drainage ditch, at the pasture fence in the dusk when she'd told him about Vern Calloway. Last night, when she'd slid the ledger across the table and trusted him with the numbers. Each time he'd measured the cost of the truth against the cost of one more day's silence and chosen wrong. And he knew he'd chosen wrong each time, and he'd done it anyway because the truth would change the expression on her face in a way he didn't want to be responsible for. That was the honest version of it. He was protecting himself, not her. He folded the notice and put it back in his coat. Trouble looked at him with the patient, brown-eyed assessment of a horse that has watched a man make the same mistake several times and has resigned itself to the process. "I know," Wyatt said. The horse looked away. He had 9 more days before the auction if he was going to stop it. He was going to stop it. That much was settled in him, with a firmness that didn't require debate. Whatever happened after, the auction was not going to happen. He was not going to let Abigail Hart lose this land to a courthouse process that existed because he had run from his grief instead of facing it. But first he had to tell her. He spent the rest of the morning building the argument in his head for how to do it. Where, in what order, with what lead-up. By noon he had 3 versions organized and hated all of them. By afternoon he'd stopped organizing and started just watching her work, which was easier and more painful in equal measure. She was repairing the henhouse roof, a section of planking that had warped over the summer and was letting cold air in through a gap at the north corner. She had a bucket of nails and a hammer and a plank she'd cut to length from the woodpile scrap, and she was doing the job with the methodical patience of someone who has fixed enough things alone to have stopped thinking of it as remarkable. Molly was beside her, handing nails up from the bucket with the focused responsibility of someone trusted with an important task. He stood at the barn door and watched. The sun was going down behind the western ridge, and the light was that particular late afternoon gold that makes everything it touches look considered. The hen house, and the 2 of them working at it, the yard with its frost-stiffened grass, the smoke from the chimney carrying the smell of the wood he'd split. I was going to lose this view when he told her. That was what he kept coming back to. Not the property question, not the legal complexity. Just this specific thing, this ordinary early winter evening, this woman on a ladder and her daughter handing up nails, this sense of being somewhere that had weight and shape and meaning. He was going to tell her the truth, and she was going to look at him differently, and this particular version of the last 9 days was going to become something else retroactively. He crossed the yard. I need to talk to you, he said. Tonight, after Molly's down. Abigail looked at him from the ladder. She read something in his face. He could see it register, the recognition that whatever this was, it was the thing he'd been carrying. All right, she said. She turned back to the planking and drove the next nail. Molly went to bed at 8, only moderately resistantly, and Wyatt sat at the kitchen table and waited while Abigail went through the evening routines, banking the stove, checking the door latch, filling the water pitcher for morning. Each task deliberate and familiar, the routine of a person who has learned that the small maintenance of daily life is not trivial. She sat down across from him. He put the notice on the table between them. She looked at it. Then she picked it up and read it. He watched her face while she read, watched the small changes in her expression as the words organized themselves into meaning, the slight narrowing of her eyes, the stillness that came over her when she reached the name on the property record, Mercer Homestead. She set the notice back on the table. She looked at him. Her expression was careful in the way that a person's face is careful when they're managing something large that they don't yet have the full shape of. Wyatt Mercer, she said. Yes. This is your land. Yes. A silence that had weight in it. The whole time, she said. Yes. Something moved across her face. Not the explosion he'd half expected and half deserved, but something more controlled and in some ways harder to watch. The working through of something. The first night, she said, at this table, I told you. She stopped, started again. I told you I'd built this. I told you the county had the auction scheduled. I told you what this place meant. Her voice was level, but underneath it was something that wasn't level at all. And you sat there. Yes, he said. There was nothing else to say to that. Why? He looked at the notice on the table. I was trying to figure out how to tell you. I kept telling myself I'd tell you the next day, then the next. That's not a reason, she said. That's a description of what happened. You're right, he said. The reason is that I was a coward about it. You told me what this place was to you, and I knew what was in my pocket, and I chose not to say it because I didn't want to see your face change. She looked at him steadily. My face change, she repeated. The way it's changing now, he said. She stood up. Not in anger, or not only in anger. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, arms crossed, looking out at the dark yard. 5 years, she said. The taxes have been owed 5 years. Yes. You left. After my family died, he said. My wife. My son. He was 7. The words came out even because he'd carried them so long they'd worn smooth. There was a fire in the old house down in the ravine. They were in it and I wasn't. I came home and it was gone. The room was very quiet. Abigail didn't turn around, but her posture changed slightly. The hard set of her shoulders shifted, not softening exactly, but becoming something more complicated. I rode out, he said. I told myself I'd come back and deal with it. I didn't. I kept not coming back until the county finally sent a notice to enough forwarding addresses that it caught up with me. So you came back for the land, she said. I came back because of the notice, yes. Not for us, she said. You didn't know we were here. No, he said. I didn't know you were here. She turned from the window. Her face had the expression of someone doing a calculation that doesn't resolve cleanly. The grief he'd told her about sitting alongside the betrayal of the last 9 days, and the two of them refusing to add up into a single clean response. What do you want? She said. With this property. What do you want? I want to pay the taxes, he said. Stop the auction. And then? I don't know, he said. I came back with a plan that ended at the county tax office. I didn't plan for you. That's honest, at least, she said. I owe you honesty. I owe you more than that. She pulled out the chair across from him, but didn't sit. Stood behind it with her hands on the back, looking at him. I've put 5 years into this place, she said. Everything I had. Every day of it. I know. You don't know, she said sharply, and the control in her voice cracked just for a second. You don't know what it was when I got here. You don't know what the first winter was, with Molly sick for 2 weeks in January, and the well half frozen, and the cattle. There were no cattle. There was nothing. There was a broken-down house with the windows out, and I stayed because I didn't have anywhere else to go, and then I stayed because I decided to. Her jaw was tight. I decided to make something of it because that's what you do when you run out of other options. And the only thing left is the thing right in front of you. You work it until it's worth working. What you built here, he started. Don't tell me what I built, she said. I know what I built. What I want to know is whether you're going to take it. The question sat on the table between them. He thought about how many ways he could answer it, how many words he could put around it. No, he said. No, you're not going to take it. No. She studied him. You could, she said. Legally, you could pay those taxes, take possession, and tell me to go. That's what the paper says. I know what the paper says. Then tell me why I should believe you when you say no, she said. You've been lying to me since you rode in the gate. I've been lying to you since I rode in the gate, he said. That's true. And you have every reason not to believe me. I'm not asking you to trust me tonight. I'm asking you to let me show you what I mean by what I said. A long silence. From down the hallway came the small sounds of Molly sleeping. A shift, a sigh, the particular stillness of a child in deep sleep. Abigail looked at the door to the hallway, then back at him. She likes you, she said. It came out like an accusation and a confession at the same time. I know, he said. I like her. That doesn't fix this. No, he said. It doesn't. She let go of the chair back and sat down. She put both hands flat on the table like she was steadying herself on a surface she wasn't sure of. I need to think, she said. All right. I'm not going to make any decisions tonight. I'm not asking you to. And you're not staying in this house, she said. You're in the barn until I figure out how I feel about this. That's fair, he said. She looked at the notice on the table. You should go, she said. He stood, picked up the notice, and then, after a moment's hesitation, set it back on the table in front of her. That's yours to keep, he said. You have as much right to know what it says as I do. He went out the back door and crossed the dark yard to the barn. The cold hit him when he stepped outside. A real cold now, not the preliminary chill of the past days, but the full weight of a Colorado November settling in to stay. He could see his breath in the moonlight. He lay in the barn with his coat on and did not sleep for a long time. In the morning, she was already in the yard when he came out, pitching hay to the cattle with the particular focused energy of a person who has been awake longer than is useful and has converted the surplus into work. He got the water and broke the trough ice without being asked. They moved through the morning chores in a silence that was different from all the previous silences. Still functional, still coordinated, but with a distance in it that hadn't been there before. I was relatching the henhouse when he heard a horse on the road. He didn't think much of it at first. Then the sound didn't pass. It slowed, turned, came up the track. He straightened and looked toward the gate. The man who rode in was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something harder. He rode a good horse, too good for most men in this county, which said something about him. He wore his coat like someone who thought about how he looked in it. He stopped in the middle of the yard and looked around with the proprietary ease of a man assessing something he considers his business. Then he looked at Wyatt, then at Abigail, who had stopped with the pitchfork in her hands. Abigail Hart, the man said. Not a greeting, an identification. Vern Calloway, Abigail said. Her voice was flat and controlled, and Wyatt could hear underneath it something he recognized from last night. The sound of a person managing a large, unpleasant thing with the resources they have available. Calloway swung down from his horse with the deliberate ease of a man who wants you to watch him move. He was smiling, which was somehow worse than if he hadn't been. Rode up from town this morning, he said. Heard at the county office that the auction's set. Wanted to check on you. His eyes moved to Wyatt. Who's this? Someone who works here, Abigail said. Hired hand, Calloway said, with the faint, specific dismissal of a man categorizing people he finds unimportant. Something like that, Wyatt said. Calloway looked at him for a moment longer than polite, the way men do when they're establishing something, then turned back to Abigail. I heard you're in a hard spot, he said. Tax debt. Auction in 2 weeks. He shook his head with performed sympathy. That's a hard thing for a woman in your position. My position is fine, Abigail said. Now don't be like that, he said. I came up here out of consideration for the girl, same as I did 2 years ago. Molly's Thomas's blood. Whatever happened between you and Thomas, that child has family that wants to look after her. Molly has a mother, Abigail said. She doesn't need looking after. She's going to need somewhere to go, Calloway said. When this property sells out from under you, he spread his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. I'm not saying it as a threat, Abigail. I'm saying it as reality. The county's going to auction this land. You're going to need somewhere to go. Where are you going to take that little girl? Back on the road? Another town where nobody knows you? Wyatt had been standing still through this, reading the architecture of it. The way Calloway had come in easy and positioned himself in the middle of the yard. The way he'd dismissed Wyatt as categorically unimportant. The way he was using Molly's name as a lever, pressing it gently, measuring how much weight it would bear. He knew this kind of man. He'd met him in half a dozen forms across 5 years of being nowhere. The kind of man who shows up when something is weakest and frames his appetite as concern. The auction's not happening, Wyatt said. Calloway looked at him. Looked at him the way a man looks at something that has stepped outside the category he assigned it to. Excuse me? The taxes are being settled, Wyatt said. The auction's canceled. Calloway's eyes moved to Abigail and back. And who are you exactly to be making that kind of statement? The legal owner of this property, Wyatt said. Wyatt Mercer. The yard went quiet. The cattle moved in the pasture. A cold wind crossed from the north and found every gap in every piece of clothing any of them was wearing. Calloway looked at him for a long time. Something shifted in the man's face. A quick recalculation, the adjustment of a plan encountering an unexpected variable. Mercer, he said slowly. That's right. Calloway looked at Abigail, looked at the house, looked back at Wyatt with new, unfriendly attention. Well, he said, that does change things. It changes exactly one thing, Wyatt said. The auction. Everything else stays as it is. I don't think you understand the situation here, Calloway said, and the friendliness had gone out of his voice entirely now, leaving something more functional and more honest. This woman has no legal claim to this land. If you're the owner, that means she's been squatting. And a woman squatting on someone else's property with a child, no legal standing. She's been maintaining this property for 5 years, Wyatt said. Building it, improving it. While I was absent and the taxes went unpaid, she was the only reason this place still exists in a form worth saving. That's not a legal argument, Calloway said. I'm not making a legal argument, Wyatt said. I'm telling you how it is. Calloway looked at him with a smile that had gone cold around the edges. Mr. Mercer, he said, I came here about the welfare of a child. Thomas Calloway's daughter. I don't think a judge in this territory would look unkindly on a family member seeking to provide for her. Thomas Calloway has been absent for 4 years, Abigail said. Her voice was steady, but Wyatt could see her hands tight on the pitchfork handle. He sent 1 letter and disappeared. He provided nothing. Family circumstances are complicated, Calloway said smoothly. Courts understand that. Go home, Vern, Abigail said. I'll go, he said. But I want you both to understand that I have interests here that aren't going away because Mr. Mercer showed up. His eyes moved to Wyatt, and there was nothing warm in them at all now. I'll be watching how this plays out. He mounted his horse with the same deliberate ease he'd dismounted with, turned it in the yard, and rode back down the track to the road. They stood in the yard and watched him go. When the sound of hooves had faded, Abigail turned to Wyatt. Her face was controlled, but her eyes were working through something hard. "You told him you were the owner," she said. "Yes." "In front of me?" "Yes." She looked at the track where Calloway had gone. "He'll use that," she said. "He'll use it to argue that you have authority over this land and I have none, and that Molly's living situation is Abigail." He waited until she looked at him. "I'm not going to let that happen." "You said that last night too," she said, "about taking the land." "I meant it last night," he said. "I mean it now." She looked at him. The same measuring look she'd given him on the very first day, when he'd come up the track on a tired horse, and she'd stood on the porch with her bucket deciding whether he was a threat. This time, what she was measuring was different. He could see her working it out, the lie he'd told, and the truth he'd told, and the man who'd just ridden away, and what any of it added up to. "I'm going inside," she said. "Molly will be up soon." He nodded. She walked past him toward the house and then stopped 3 steps away, with her back still to him. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said to him." She went inside. The door closed behind her. He stood in the cold yard and let the wind move through him, and looked southeast toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the ravine, and thought about 5 years of running and what it cost and what it left behind. Then he went to saddle Trouble, whose leg was healed enough now. He had a ride to make to the county seat. He had taxes to pay. The ride to the county seat took most of a day. Trouble moved well, the fetlock fully healed, the horse carrying himself with the recovered energy of an animal that has been properly rested and fed, which was itself a testament to Abigail's judgment, since she'd been the one to insist on the rest in the first place. Wyatt rode at a pace that covered ground without punishing either of them, and he kept his thoughts on the road ahead rather than on what he'd left behind, which was a discipline he had to actively maintain. The county seat of Harlan was a proper town, larger than the settlement 4 miles from the ranch, with a main street that ran 6 blocks and held a courthouse, 2 banks, a hotel, 3 saloons, a hardware merchant, and the particular mix of permanence and ambition that a place develops when it's decided it intends to stay. Wyatt had been here twice before, years ago, for the deed filing, and once before that for a dispute over water rights that had been settled without drama. He tied Trouble at the rail outside the county tax office and went in. The clerk was a thin man in his 40s with the careful, slightly worn look of someone who has spent years processing other people's crises across a wooden counter. He looked at Wyatt with professional neutrality. "Mercer Homestead," Wyatt said. "North of the main road, Harlan County Survey Marker Post 47. I need to settle the outstanding taxes." The clerk turns to his ledger, ran a finger down the page. "Full amount," Wyatt said, before the man could ask. "Whatever it is. I want the auction notice canceled and a receipt showing the account is cleared." The clerk looked up at him. "You're the owner of record?" "I am." "Some identification." Wyatt put the deed on the counter. The clerk examined it, compared it to the ledger, looked at Wyatt once more, and then began writing up the settlement figure. When he pushed the paper across the counter, Wyatt looked at the number. It was almost everything he had in the Pueblo Bank. The accumulated 5 years of wages and odd work, and the careful, purposeless saving of a man who had nothing to spend money on because he had nothing he was building toward. He wrote the bank draft without hesitation, which surprised him slightly. He'd expected it to be harder to let go of. It wasn't. It was in fact almost easy, and the ease of it told him something about what the money had actually been for all this time, without him knowing it. The clerk processed the draft, stamped the settlement record, wrote out the receipt, and canceled the auction notice with 2 lines of ink and an official seal. "The property's clear," the clerk said, sliding the paperwork back. "Thank you," Wyatt said. He folded the receipt into his coat pocket and walked out into the cold afternoon. He didn't ride back immediately. There was something else he needed to do first, and he'd known it since the morning. Since standing in the yard watching Vern Calloway ride away, and looking southeast toward the cottonwoods and finally running out of reasons to keep looking away from what was there. He left trouble at the rail and walked to the end of the main street where a telegraph office sat between a land surveyor and a notary. He sent a wire to a lawyer in Pueblo named Alderton, who he'd used once for a property question and who had struck him as competent and thorough. The wire was brief. Property matter, Harlan County, need to establish occupancy rights and protections for current residents, will pay for expedited review. I didn't know if it would matter. He didn't know what the legal terrain looked like for Abigail's 5 years of occupancy and improvement. But Calloway had said courts and judges with the specific confidence of a man who believed the law was a tool available to people like him, and Wyatt had no intention of letting that go unanswered. He got back on trouble as the sun was tilting toward the western peaks and rode north. Hun made the ranch by late evening. The house lights were on. He unsaddled Trouble in the barn, fed and watered him, and stood in the dark yard for a moment with the receipt in his coat pocket and the cold coming down from the mountains with the serious intent of a Colorado November. The front door opened before he reached the porch. Abigail stood in the doorway with the lamp in her hand and the light behind her, and her expression was the expression of someone who has spent a day in uncertainty and is only now getting the information that settles it. "Did you do it?" she said. He climbed the porch steps and held out the receipt. She took it and looked at it in the lamplight. Her face changed, not dramatically, not with the release of someone who's been holding their breath and finally lets it go, but with something quieter, a settling. The careful reorganization of a person adjusting to a ground that has just become less uncertain under their feet. "The auction's canceled," he said. She looked at the receipt for another moment. Then she stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "There's food." Molly was still at the table, fighting sleep with the focused determination of a child who believes that enough willpower can override biology. She looked up when Wyatt came in, and her face did the thing it always did. The quick, bright opening of someone genuinely glad to see you, which Wyatt had stopped trying to be unaffected by because it was impossible. "Mama said you went to town," she said. "I did." "Did you fix things?" He looked at Abigail, who was setting a plate on the table. "Working on it," he said. "Molly," Abigail said, "it's past your time." "I know," Molly said, with the tone of someone acknowledging a fact they find inconvenient. She slid off her chair, retrieved her rag doll from the shelf, and came to stand in front of Wyatt with the gravity of a small person who has something to say and intends to say it. "That man who came this morning," she said. "Vern Calloway." Wyatt looked at her carefully. "You heard that." "Some of it," she said, "from the window." No apology in it. Just the direct acknowledgement of a child who doesn't waste time pretending. "He wants to take me away." "I wants to think he does," Wyatt said. "There's a difference." She considered this. "What's the difference?" "Wanting something and being able to get it," he said. "They're not the same." She looked at him with those old eyes in that young face. "Are you going to stop him?" "Yes," he said. She studied him for another moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she found there. She turned and went down the hallway to her room with the unhurried confidence of a child who has been told something true by someone who meant it. Abigail watched her go. Then she looked at Wyatt. "Don't say things to her that you're not certain of," she said quietly. "I'm certain of that one," he said. She put a fork on the table beside the plate. "Sit down," she said. "Eat." "But," Hun ate. She sat across from him with her coffee. The stove was warm and the lamp was low, and the house had the particular nighttime quality of a place that has gotten through another day intact. "Calloway came back while you were gone," she said. Wyatt looked up. "Not here," she said. "Elspeth Crawford sent a boy up the road this afternoon with a note. Said Calloway had been at the county clerk's office asking about the property transfer records, asking whether there were any registered claims beyond the deed." "He's looking for leverage," Wyatt said. "He's looking for a crack," she said. "That's how he works. He finds the crack, and then he pushes." She turned her cup. "He went to see Reverend Howell in town too, apparently, asking about Molly. Whether she'd been seen, whether she seemed cared for, whether there were concerns. The specific calculation of it, going to find witnesses, building a file, preparing arguments for a custody case he didn't have yet, made Wyatt put down his fork. "He's not just opportunistic," he said. "He's been planning this." "Since Thomas disappeared," Abigail said. "Maybe before." She said it with the flat precision of a woman who has had a long time to understand what she's dealing with. Thomas told me once, before he left, that Vern had been the one who really ran things in that family. That Thomas had spent his whole life trying to get out from under it. She paused. Maybe that's why Thomas never came back. Maybe Vern was part of why he ran. That doesn't excuse Thomas leaving Molly, Wyatt said. No, she said, it doesn't. She looked at her coffee. But it explains some things. He picked up his fork again, though the food had gone less interesting. What did you do today, besides the message from Elspeth? Fix the henhouse latch properly, she said. The wire was a temporary fix. I used a real hinge pin. He almost smiled. I also, she said, went down to the ravine. He went still. She looked at him directly. I've lived on this land for 5 years and I've never gone down there, she said. I always told myself it was respect for whatever happened, but today I went. He didn't say anything. The foundation's still there, she said. The chimney. Most of the stone walls of what I think was the original structure before it burned. She paused. There's a small marker by the east wall. 2 names. I couldn't read them well. The weathering was bad. But they were there. He put down his fork. The sound of it on the plate was very small in the quiet kitchen. Clara, he said, and James. She said nothing, just waited. My wife and my son, he said. James was 7. He had a habit of leaving his boots by the wrong door, always the far door from where he'd need them, and every morning I'd carry them around the house to where they needed to be. He stopped, started again. I don't know why I remember that specifically. There are bigger things I remember, but that's the one that comes back. Abigail's hands were still around her cup. The fire started in the roof, he said. I'd been meaning to fix a section of the chimney flashing for 2 weeks. I kept putting it off because there was always something more urgent. He looked at the table. I was in town when it happened. Came back to smoke. The stove ticked. Outside the wind had picked up, moving through the cottonwoods with that low breathing sound. It wasn't your fault, she said. I know that, he said. I've known that for 4 years. Knowing it and being done with it aren't the same thing. No, she said. They're not. He looked up at her. She was watching him with the direct, uncomplicated attention of someone who is not trying to fix what she's hearing, just receiving it. I left because being here was being in it every minute, he said. Every fence post, every morning, every room. It was all where they'd been, where they weren't anymore. He pushed the plate aside. Running made the distance between me and it. I thought eventually the distance would be enough. Was it? No, he said. But it got easier to pretend. She looked at him for a long time. And now you're back, she said. And now I'm back, he said. And you're here. And Molly's here. And the place that I left as a... He stopped. You turned it into something. You turned the worst thing I know into something worth coming back to. And I don't know what to do with that. The silence stretched long enough to become something. I'm still angry with you, she said, about the lying. That's fair, he said. It's going to take more than paying a tax bill, she said. I know. And whatever you're thinking, she said, about Vern and Molly and this property, you don't get to decide everything yourself and present it to me as settled. I'm not a problem you solve. No, he said, you're not. She stood and took her cup to the wash basin. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow we need to talk about the property arrangement, properly, with everything on the table. She turned around. You can sleep inside, the spare room off the kitchen, but Wyatt, he waited. Don't lie to me again, she said, about anything. I'd rather have a hard truth than a comfortable, I'd rather just know. Understood, he said. She went to her room. He sat at the table alone for a while, listening to the house. I was up before dawn. He didn't plan to go to the ravine. He found himself going anyway, in the gray pre-light of a cold morning, crossing the south pasture with frost crunching under his boots, and his breath making small clouds in the still air. The cottonwoods were bare now, their branches white with frost, and the path down into the ravine was overgrown but navigable. He found it by instinct, the way you find things you learned when you were young enough to learn them without knowing you were. The ruin was smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing. He stood at the edge of it and looked. The stone walls of the original cabin, the one his grandfather had built, the one his father had added to, the one he'd grown up in before he'd built the main house, were still standing to about chest height, blackened along the upper courses where the fire had been hottest. The chimney was intact, still rising a good 8 feet, which seemed faintly absurd given what had happened around it. The wooden structure that had grown up around the original stone was gone entirely, reduced to the kind of charcoal stain on the ground that you'd miss if you weren't looking. 2 stone markers stood against the east wall. He'd put them there himself, that terrible spring morning, before he rode out. He hadn't been able to do much. He'd done that much. He crouched in front of them and ran his thumb over the carved names. The weathering was bad. Abigail was right. The lettering was getting hard to read. He should do something about that. He stayed crouched there for a while, long enough for the cold to work through his coat and his knees to complain. He didn't try to say anything, because he'd never been a man who knew how to talk to the dead, and starting now felt dishonest. But he stayed. He let the place be what it was, the worst thing, and also a place. Just a place in a ravine with old stone walls and frost on the ground and the sound of the creek 20 feet east running thin and cold under a skim of ice. He'd been treating it in his head like a wound he couldn't look at. Turns out it was just a place. That didn't make it not hurt. But it made it bearable in a way that 5 years of distance hadn't managed. He stood up, looked at the markers one more time. "I came back," he said. It was all he had. He figured it was enough. He walked back up to the main house as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. That morning, at the kitchen table, with Molly occupied in the barn under the stated purpose of checking on trouble, a task she'd appointed herself to with considerable enthusiasm, Wyatt put the deed on the table alongside the tax receipt and a piece of paper he'd written on the night before. Abigail looked at the piece of paper. "It's a proposed co-ownership arrangement," he said. "I had some of the language from an old document I'd seen years ago. It's not legal. You'd need a lawyer to make it proper, but it's what I mean." She read it. He watched her face. The document was straightforward. The Mercer homestead, equally shared between Wyatt Mercer and Abigail Hart, with joint decision-making authority and equal standing in all matters pertaining to the property. Her name on the deed beside his. She looked up. "This is what you want?" "It's what makes sense," he said. "You built it. You earned standing in it that a deed should reflect." "That's not the same as what you want," she said. He looked at the document, then at her. "I want to stay," he said. "If you'll have me. Not as a hired hand and not as the owner who's letting you live here. As someone who's part of this. If that's something you're willing to consider." She was quiet for a long time. "You've been here 2 weeks," she said. "I know. You lied to me. I know that too." "And you think that's enough to build something from?" she said. It wasn't sarcastic. It was a genuine question, asked with the gravity of a woman who has built things from almost nothing before and knows exactly what the process costs. "I think it's a start," he said. "If you want to start." She looked at the document again, then out the window, at the yard and the pasture and the cattle moving in the morning cold. "I need to think," she said. "Take the time you need," he said. "The property's not going anywhere, neither am I. Not unless you tell me to." She folded the document carefully and set it beside the deed. "Go fix the gate latch," she said. "It's been sticking for a week." He stood. "All right," he said. "Wyatt." She didn't look up from the table. "Yes, the markers in the ravine," she said. "The lettering's going. You should recut them before spring." He stood in the kitchen doorway with the cold coming in around the frame and the weight of the last 2 weeks sitting on him in a way that was different from how any weight had sat on him in a long time. Not the dead heaviness of grief carried alone, but something more complicated, something that had friction and resistance and the particular quality of things that are actually real. "I'll do that," he said. He went to fix the gate latch. Vern Calloway came back 4 days later. This time he brought a man with him, younger, with a county clerk's badge on his coat and a leather satchel and the look of someone who has been told this is a routine matter and is beginning to suspect it isn't. They came up the track mid-morning on a weekday, when the yard was visible from the north fence where Wyatt was working. He saw them from a distance and watched them come, and took his time walking back to the yard, and arrived at the gate at about the same moment Abigail came out of the house. Calloway looked at Wyatt with the expression of a man who had expected to find things in a different configuration. "Mr. Mercer," he said, with a careful pleasantness. "I brought Mr. Dowd from the county assessor's office. He has some questions about the property status." "The property's settled," Wyatt said. "Taxes paid. I have the receipt." "Yes, I know the taxes are paid," Calloway said. "The questions are about the current occupancy arrangement." He said the last two words with the delicacy of a man handling something he intends to use as a weapon, specifically whether the current residents have a legal standing, given the property is held in a single name. Wyatt looked at him. Then he looked at the clerk, who had the sheepish expression of someone regretting the company he'd ridden with. The property arrangement is being updated, Wyatt said. By the time whatever process Mr. Calloway is attempting to start has moved through the county system, the deed will reflect both residents' standing. Calloway's smile went thin. Both residents, he said. Abigail Hart is being added to the deed, Wyatt said. As co-owner, equal standing. The clerk blinked. Calloway did not blink. He looked at Abigail with the expression of a man recalculating and not enjoying the arithmetic. That's an unusual arrangement, Calloway said slowly. It's an accurate one, Wyatt said. Mr. Mercer, Calloway said, dropping the pleasantness entirely now. I want to be direct with you. The girl, Molly, is Thomas Calloway's blood. Whatever arrangement you make with her mother doesn't change that. A judge would want to know that a child is being properly provided for, by family. She's being provided for, Wyatt said, by her mother, on her mother's land. You can't guarantee. Vern. Wyatt's voice came out quiet and level, and it had the quality of a door closing. I'm going to say this once. Molly Hart is home. This is her home. It will remain her home, and the people responsible for her are standing in this yard. Whatever case you think you're building, whatever you've been collecting from county clerks and town preachers and wherever else, it ends here. I will spend every dollar I have and every day I have fighting whatever you bring, and when it's over, all you'll have done is spent a lot of time and money losing. The yard was very quiet. The clerk had taken a step back and was looking at the ground. Calloway looked at Wyatt for a long moment with cold, considered attention. Then he looked at Abigail, then at the house, where Molly's face was just barely visible at the window, watching, as she always was, taking everything in with those wide, careful eyes. Something shifted in Calloway's face. Not defeat. Men like Calloway didn't show defeat. They showed calculation. What shifted was the assessment of cost versus return. Wyatt could see it happening. The man was not a fool. He was a man who picked fights he could win, and what he was looking at now was a fight that had gotten more expensive than he'd priced it. This isn't finished, Calloway said. It's as finished as you let it be, Wyatt said. Calloway looked at him one more time. Then he turned his horse and rode out. The clerk went with him, with visible relief. Abigail stood at Wyatt's shoulder and watched them go. When the sound of hooves had faded down the road, she let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding since they rode in. You think he'll come back? She said. Maybe, Wyatt said. Men like that don't give up easy, but the easy opportunity's gone. He was banking on the auction leaving you exposed. The auction's gone, and if the deed change goes through, it will go through, she said. There was something different in her voice. He turned and looked at her. She was looking at him with that measuring expression, the one he'd seen on the first day and 100 times since, the one that calculated and weighed and did not offer conclusions before it was ready. I've been thinking, she said, about your proposal. And? She looked at the gate he'd fixed the week before, the fence line, the pasture, the house she'd built from nothing on the bones of his grief. I think, she said slowly, that a person would have to be fairly stubborn and fairly foolish to say no to someone who just did what you did. Or fairly cautious, he said. Caution's a reasonable response. I've been cautious for 5 years, she said. It's kept me alive. She looked at him. I think what I need now is something different. He waited. Yes, she said, to the arrangement, to the start of it. She said it clearly and without ornamentation and met his eyes when she said it, and he understood it for what it was. Not a declaration, not a promise, just a door opening. The way doors open on the frontier, with work still to do on the hinge and no guarantee of what the weather would bring. All right, he said. Don't make me regret it, she said. I'll try, he said. Can't promise. She looked at him sharply. Then something in her face, for the first time in all the days he'd known her, came loose from the careful management she'd kept over it. Not completely, not with abandon, but enough. Enough to be visible. Enough to be real. Go get Molly, she said. She'll want to know Calloway's gone. He went to the house, and when he opened the door, Molly was right there in the hallway, ragdoll under her arm and eyes bright with questions she'd been saving. Is he gone? She said. He's gone, Wyatt said. She looked past him toward the yard where her mother was standing, then back at him. Is he coming back? Maybe, he said, but if he does, we'll be ready. She considered this. Then she took his hand, just reached up and took it, with the complete, uncalculated trust of a child who has made a decision about a person, and walked with him back out into the yard, into the cold November light, toward her mother. Wyatt looked down at the small hand in his and felt the weight of it. Not heavy, but real, specific, particular in the way that only true things are particular. He held on. The lawyer from Pueblo arrived on a Thursday in early December, 3 weeks after Wyatt had sent the wire. His name was Alderton, a compact, deliberate man in his late 40s who wore a good coat and carried a satchel that looked like it had seen considerable use, which Wyatt took as a positive sign. Men whose satchels looked new generally hadn't opened them enough to know what was inside. Alderton came up the track in a hired wagon, introduced himself to Abigail with a handshake rather than a bow, looked around the yard with the calm professional attention of someone assessing a situation rather than admiring a view, and sat down at the kitchen table with his papers in a way that suggested he was used to kitchen tables and didn't consider them beneath him. Molly regarded him from the hallway with the focused suspicion she reserved for new arrivals until she'd taken their measure. Alderton noticed her and nodded once, seriously, as though acknowledging a colleague, and something in Molly's expression shifted fractionally toward acceptance. The deed transfer took 2 hours, not because it was complicated, the legal mechanism was straightforward enough, but because Alderton was thorough, and thorough meant he asked questions, and some of those questions required answers that Wyatt and Abigail had to work out between themselves in real time, across the kitchen table, with a lawyer watching. What share of the property? How decisions would be made in dispute? What would happen to the property if either of them died? Whether Molly's interests were to be formalized in any way. That last question produced a silence that lasted long enough for Alderton to look up from his papers. You don't have to address that today, he said, but I'd recommend thinking about it. Abigail looked at the table, then at Wyatt. What are you thinking? She said, not challenging, asking, the real kind. I think she should have standing, Wyatt said. Whatever happens between us or doesn't happen, she should have standing in this property. It's her home. Abigail looked at him steadily. You'd put her name on the deed, if you're willing. She's not your blood, she said, not as an objection, as a statement of fact that she was giving him the opportunity to respond to clearly. No, he said. She's not. He paused. But she talked to the people in the burned house when she couldn't sleep because she thought it was the right thing to do. That's enough for me. Abigail's throat moved. She looked at Alderton. Can we do that? We can draft a provision, he said. It'll take another document, but yes, it's done regularly in property arrangements of this kind. Then do it, Abigail said. Alderton wrote. Wyatt watched Abigail's hands on the table, still, composed, but with a quality of held feeling in them that he'd come to recognize over the past weeks. She felt things completely and expressed them economically, which was its own kind of language once you learned to read it. When all the documents were signed and witnessed, Alderton had brought a second man from town for the purpose, a hardware merchant named Pruitt, who signed with the pleased importance of someone being included in something. The lawyer assembled his papers with the satisfied neatness of a completed job. The co-ownership is filed, he said. The provision for the minor child is drafted and will be filed upon your final signatures at the county seat. I'd recommend doing that within the month. He looked at both of them. With regard to the Calloway matter, his position was always weak. A paternal great-uncle with no prior custodial standing, making a claim against a present, capable mother. The property security eliminates the primary vulnerability he was targeting. My assessment is that he moves on to easier ground. And if he doesn't, Abigail said, then you have the deed, the improvements record, and 5 years of uncontested occupancy, and I'll be glad to represent you. He said it with the plain confidence of someone who has won arguments before and knows what winning looks like. He doesn't have much of a case. He had an opportunity. He lost it. He left before noon, his wagon going back down the track toward the main road, with the particular satisfied motion of a resolved errand. Abigail stood on the porch and watched it go. Wyatt stood beside her. It's real now, she said. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a moment. I keep waiting to feel like it's real, she said, It still feels like something that might get taken back. I know that feeling, he said. Does it go away? He thought about that honestly. Some of it, he said. Not all at once, but some of it. She nodded. Then she went back inside, because there was bread to make, and the afternoon wasn't getting longer, and Wyatt stood on the porch alone for another minute and looked at the yard and the pasture and the line of bare cottonwoods along the creek, and let the realness of it settle into him the way warmth settles, gradually, from the outside in. December arrived and stayed. The first real snow came the second week. Not a dusting, but a proper Colorado snowfall that put 8 inches on the ground overnight and turned the ranch into a different version of itself, quieter and heavier, and somehow more defined. The fence line showed clean against the white. The cattle bunched at the hay feeder Wyatt had built against the barn's south wall, breath steaming, patient. The henhouse held its heat. The kitchen garden was buried under a clean white layer that would, Abigail said, do the soil some good. The work of winter was different from the work of fall. Less building, more maintaining, the daily rounds of feeding and watering and checking and adjusting that keep animals alive and structures sound through cold that had opinions about both. Wyatt and Abigail divided it without long discussion, each taking the parts that made sense, given what they knew and what they were better at, the division emerging from use rather than assignment. It wasn't seamless. There were mornings when they disagreed about the cattle rotation and said so directly, and at least one argument about the henhouse ventilation that got louder than either of them had intended before Molly appeared in the doorway with her rag doll and the expression of someone who would like the adults to resolve their differences more quietly. Sorry, Abigail said to Molly, and then to Wyatt, in that order. Sorry, Wyatt said. Thank you, Molly said, and withdrew. They looked at each other across the henhouse, and Abigail pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was fighting something that wanted to be a laugh, and Wyatt found the argument had gone out of him entirely. The ventilation stays as it is for the winter, he said. We can argue about it again in spring. Fine, she said. But I'm right. You might be, he said. We'll find out in spring. She went back to the house. He went back to the fence check. And the snow came down around the ranch in the particular silence of a heavy fall, and the cattle stood at the feeder, and the smoke rose from the chimney, and the ranch held. It was Elspeth Crawford who told them first. She sent a note up with the supply delivery in mid-December, written in her small, precise hand. Calloway left town on the 10th. Heard he went south. Thought you'd want to know. Abigail read the note at the kitchen table and set it down and sat with it for a moment. You believe it? She said. Alderton said he'd moved to easier ground, Wyatt said. Elspeth's not a woman who reports things inaccurately. No, Abigail said. She's not. She looked at the note. I want to believe it. Then believe it, he said, carefully, but believe it. She folded the note and put it in the drawer where she kept the important papers. The deed, the tax receipt, the documents Alderton had left. The drawer of things that were real and settled. Wyatt had seen her open that drawer several times in the past weeks, not to retrieve anything, just to check that what was in it was still there. He understood that. Some things you need to verify a few times before they become background fact, rather than active question. Christmas came to the Mercer Ranch quietly. There was no particular ceremony about it. Abigail was not a woman given to ceremony for its own sake, and Wyatt had long since stopped marking the holiday in any organized way. But Molly had views, which she expressed with the reasoned persistence of a child who has thought the situation through and believes her position is sound. Other families do things for Christmas, she said at supper 3 days before. We're not other families, Abigail said. I know, Molly said, but we could do a thing, one thing. Abigail looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at his plate. What kind of thing? Abigail said. Molly had clearly been prepared for this question. A tree, she said. Inside. With something on it. I saw it in a picture in Elspeth's store. A picture, Abigail said. From back east, Molly said. Elspeth said it's what people do. Abigail looked at Wyatt again. He raised his eyebrows in the expression of a man who has no strong opinion and is wisely staying out of the way. Fine, Abigail said. One tree. Molly's face did the thing it did, and the matter was settled. Wyatt took her out the next morning to find it. A small cedar from the south-facing slope where they grew in crooked, sturdy clusters. Not the tall, elegant trees from Molly's picture, but real trees, shaped by Colorado wind into something more interesting. Molly chose one with the deliberateness of a significant decision, and Wyatt cut it and carried it back to the house on his shoulder while she walked alongside him explaining her criteria. It has to have a good shape, she said. This one's not entirely symmetrical, he pointed out. That's okay, she said. Perfectly symmetrical things are boring. He looked down at her. Where did you hear that? He said. She considered. I think I thought of it myself, she said. You might be right about it, he said. She was. They put the tree in the corner of the front room and decorated it with what they had. A length of red ribbon Abigail found in the bottom of her sewing basket, a handful of dried berries from the kitchen, a piece of tin that Wyatt cut into a rough star shape with his knife and polished on his coat until it caught the light. It was not elegant. It was crooked and sparse, and the tin star sat at a slight angle. Molly stood back and looked at it with her hands clasped and her rag doll under her arm, with the expression of someone regarding a completed work of art. It's good, she said. It's a tree with ribbon on it, Abigail said, but she was looking at it too, and there was something in her face that had nothing to do with the tree specifically. Wyatt looked at the two of them, the woman and her daughter standing in the lamplight in front of their lopsided Christmas tree on the coldest night of December so far, in the house that had been empty and was now full, and felt something in his chest that had been locked for 5 years turn over quietly, like earth that's been frozen and is finally thawing, the slow cellular release of something returning to itself. He didn't say anything. Some things don't need saying. January was harder than December. It usually was. The cold deepened and settled in with serious intent, and 2 of the heifers got sick in the first week. Not dangerously, but enough to require twice daily checking and a miserable 3 nights where Wyatt slept in the barn to monitor them through the worst of it. He came in on the 3rd morning stiff and gray-faced and smelling of hay and livestock, and Abigail put coffee in front of him without a word, and then stood behind him and put her hands on his shoulders in the brief, matter-of-fact way of someone who has decided to stop overthinking a gesture, just for a minute. He put one hand over hers. Neither of them said anything about it, but it was there, and it was real, and it was the kind of real that doesn't require annotation. The heifers recovered. By the 3rd week of January, Wyatt had gotten the hay storage reorganized for better access and insulation, fixed a section of barn roof that had been collecting snow load in a way that worried him, and started the work of clearing and leveling a new section of the east field that Abigail had identified as potentially arable if the drainage was managed right. The ground was frozen solid, which made the initial work mostly planning and marking, but planning was its own kind of progress. He took to walking the property in the late afternoons, in the hour before the light went, not checking anything in particular. The checks were done by then, just walking. Learning the land the way you learn it by moving through it in all its weather and moods, building the knowledge that goes deeper than deed descriptions and survey markers. He'd known this land as a young man, and he'd thought that knowledge was still in him. It was, but it was old knowledge, the land as it had been, the paths and fence lines and water patterns of before. What he was building now was new knowledge, laid over the old the way new growth comes up through last year's dead grass. The same ground, read differently. I went to the ravine regularly. Not every day, but often enough that it stopped being an act of will and became simply a place he went. He'd brought a cold chisel and hammer down in early January and recut the lettering on the 2 markers, Clara Mercer, James Mercer, working carefully in the cold until the names were clear again, sharp-edged against the stone. Abigail came down once while he was working. She didn't interrupt. She stood at the edge of the ruin and looked at the markers and then at the old stone walls. And when he finished, she crouched beside him and looked at the freshly cut names in the same quiet, level way she looked at most things, without performing feeling, but not without it. They'd have liked this winter, she said. Clara, what was she like? He sat back on his heels. She argued with everything, he said. Not meanly, just she had opinions, and she shared them, and she was right often enough that you couldn't dismiss it. He paused. She would have had opinions about the hen house ventilation. Whose side would she have taken? Abigail asked. Yours, he said, without hesitation. She was always right about practical things. Abigail looked at the marker. And James? I was 7, he said. He was becoming something. You could see it starting, the person he was going to be. He was going to be someone you'd want to know. He stopped. That's the part I had the hardest time with, not knowing who he was going to become. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Molly talks to them, she said. Still, I heard her last week from the hallway. She was telling them about the Christmas tree. He looked at the markers. Yeah, he said, she told me. Did that bother you? No, he said, and it didn't. It was one of the things about Molly Hart that he had no adequate category for. The way she moved through the world with her specific, serious kindness, leaving small courtesies in the direction of things most people would overlook. It didn't bother him. It was, in a way he couldn't have explained a few months ago, a comfort. They walked back up to the main house together as the sun went down, through the snow that had crusted hard on the surface and crunched loud under their boots, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight up in the still cold air. And inside, Molly was at the table with her chalk slate making war on the letter Q, and the lamps were lit, and it was theirs. Vern Calloway came back in February. It was not what they'd expected, and it was not what Alderton had predicted, and when the sound of a single horse came up the track on a gray Tuesday morning, Wyatt was at the woodpile and Abigail was at the window, and she called his name once in the tone that meant something specific. But Calloway came differently this time. Alone, no clerk. He rode in slowly and stopped in the middle of the yard and didn't have the proprietary ease of his previous visits. He looked older than he had in November. Something in the way he sat the horse had changed. Wyatt walked to the middle of the yard and waited. Calloway looked down at him from the saddle. I'm not here to start anything, he said. All right, Wyatt said. I heard about the deed, Calloway said. Heard about the provision for the girl. He paused. I want to talk to the child. That's all. I'm not making any claim. Wyatt studied him. The cold was hard and the sky was flat white, and Calloway's horse was blowing steam in short, patient gusts. Wait there, Wyatt said. He went inside. Abigail was in the kitchen doorway, having heard. I don't trust it, she said immediately. Neither do I completely, he said. But he came alone and he said he's not making a claim. He says a lot of things. Yes, Wyatt said. But let Molly decide. She's sharp enough. If she doesn't want to talk to him, she doesn't. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to the hallway. Molly, she said. Molly appeared, ragdoll in hand, reading the room with her usual precision. There's a man in the yard, Abigail said. Vern Calloway. He's your father's uncle. He'd like to talk to you. You don't have to. Molly looked toward the front of the house, then back at her mother, then at Wyatt. Is he dangerous? We'll be right there, Wyatt said. Both of us. She thought about it. Okay, she said. They went out together, all three of them, which Wyatt thought was probably the right answer to most of the questions Calloway had been asking for the past months. Not one person standing vulnerable in a yard, but three people standing together on their ground. Calloway looked at Molly from the saddle. Something moved in his face that wasn't calculation. It might have been something simpler and harder to manage. You look like your father, he said. Molly looked up at him. I don't know what he looked like, she said. Calloway absorbed this. He was tall, he said. Brown hair. He could whistle any tune you'd sing to him, first try. Molly filed this with the careful attention she gave all information. Did you know him well? She said. Once, Calloway said. When he was young. He looked at his hands on the reins. I didn't handle things right after he was gone. I want you to know that. How I came here before, that wasn't right. Molly looked at him steadily. Are you going to try to take me away from Mama? No, he said. He said it plainly and without the lawyerly hedging of his previous visits, and it had the flat sound of something true. I'm not. Okay, Molly said. She seemed to weigh something. Do you want to know about the ranch? Calloway blinked. What? We've been working on the east field, she said. Wyatt's planning to plant it in spring, and we had a Christmas tree. It wasn't symmetrical, but that was okay. Calloway looked at her for a moment, and then, and it was unexpected enough that Wyatt nearly didn't register it, the man laughed. Not the performed pleasantness of before. Something real and brief, and a little raw. Sure, he said. Tell me about the ranch. She did. Standing in the February cold with her rag doll under her arm, she told him about the heifers that had gotten sick and gotten better, and the new hay storage, and the letter Q's ongoing failure to be reasonable. Calloway listened from his horse, and after a while he climbed down and stood in the yard and listened some more. He stayed an hour. He drank the coffee Abigail brought out. She brought it without enthusiasm, but she brought it. And he told Molly two more things about her father that she took in with the focused, archival attention she gave everything. When he left, he shook Wyatt's hand. He looked Abigail in the eye and said, "I'm sorry for how I came before." She said nothing, which was honest, and he nodded like he'd expected nothing more and didn't deserve it. He rode it down the track and didn't come back after that. Whether he'd made peace with it or simply moved on to other considerations, Wyatt couldn't say. But the threat of him had a different weight after that morning, lighter and further away. Spring arrived. The way spring arrives in the Colorado high country. Not gently, not all at once, but in the grudging, contested way of a season that has to fight for every degree of warmth. There were 3 snowfalls in March. April brought mud so deep it swallowed a fence post Wyatt had set perfectly solid in November. The creek ran high and cold with snowmelt and took out a section of the bank along the east field that he'd have to shore up before the planting. But the grass came back. It always did. And the cattle moved to the new pasture growth with a collective enthusiasm that confirmed Abigail's assessment of their health, and the hens increased their production with the additional daylight, and the east field, cleared and drained through the winter, waiting, received its first turning in late April, under a sky that was finally genuinely warm. Wyatt drove the plow, and Abigail walked behind, breaking clods, and Molly ran the perimeter of the field with the focused energy of a child for whom the return of warm weather is a personal triumph. The soil was dark and heavy and smelled like something starting, and by the end of the day they had half the field turned and Wyatt's shoulders ached with the good specific ache of work that is actually building something. At the edge of the field, taking a rest with water from the canteen, Abigail sat beside him in the turned dirt and looked out at what they'd done. "It's going to be good ground," she said. "It's already good ground," he said. "Just needed the drainage." "Most things just need the drainage," she said, which was either about farming or not, and he didn't ask. She handed the canteen back. Her hand stayed near his for a moment, and then she leaned against his shoulder in the brief, deliberate way she'd been doing since January. The way that said, "This is a choice I'm making, not an accident." And he put his arm around her, and they sat in the dirt at the edge of their field in the late April sun, and neither of them said anything, because some things don't need words. They need time and work, and the particular proof of a winter survived together. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. The town of Harlan came around slowly, the way small towns come around, not with apology or acknowledgement, but with the quiet, pragmatic revision of a community updating its assessment of someone based on accumulated evidence. Elspeth Crawford had been quietly talking for months, in the way she had, not advocating loudly, just setting the record straight when people got things wrong about Abigail Hart and the ranch she'd built. By spring, the record was different. A neighbor named Haskell, who ran cattle 3 miles west and had been politely distant since Abigail's arrival 5 years prior, stopped at the fence one afternoon in May to ask about her cattle management. He asked her, not Wyatt. Abigail answered with the plain, practical specificity she brought to everything, and Haskell listened and nodded and said he'd have to try that with the rotation and rode on. Abigail told Wyatt about it at supper. "He asked me," she said. "You're the one who knows," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "I've always been the one who knows," she said. "That's not new." "No," he said, "but now they know it too." She ate her supper. He could see her absorbing this, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the quiet recognition of a woman who has spent a long time being right without being acknowledged, and who has developed enough sense of herself not to need the acknowledgement, but who is nevertheless not entirely unmoved by it when it finally comes. Molly, across the table, was eating and watching them both with the alert, archival attention that Wyatt had come to understand was simply how she experienced the world. She was 7 now. Her birthday had been in March, marked with a cake Abigail baked and a set of proper writing lessons. Wyatt had arranged by correspondence with a teacher in town who agreed to come out once a week in good weather. The letter Q had not yet been subdued, but progress was being made. "Haskell has a daughter my age," Molly said. "I know," Abigail said. "Her name is Ruth," Molly said. "Elspeth told me. She said she thinks we might get along." Abigail looked at her. "Elspeth is usually right about these things." "I know," Molly said. "That's why I'm telling you." She returned to her food with the focused efficiency of a child who has planted a seed and is confident in the soil. Wyatt looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at her plate. Her mouth did the thing it did when she was keeping something where it was. "I'll ride over to Haskell's next week," Wyatt said. "Ask about the rotation. Bring Molly." "That would be fine," Abigail said. "Basa." On a Saturday evening in late May, after Molly was down and the day's work was behind them, Abigail and Wyatt sat on the new porch in the warm dark with coffee gone cool, and the sound of the creek running, and the cattle settled, and the whole ranch breathing quietly around them. It had been 7 months since he'd ridden up the track on a tired horse with a notice in his pocket and a plan that ended at the tax office. 7 months since she'd come out with her bucket and told him this was private property in the tone of someone who knew what she had and intended to keep it. 7 months that had held more than some years. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," she said. "Probably," he said. "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it straight, without building up to it, because every time I build up to things with you, it goes sideways." She turned to look at him. The porch light was low, one lamp through the window, and her face was half in shadow, but he'd learned to read her well enough that shadow didn't change the reading much. "All right," she said. "I want to stay," he said. "Not the arrangement. That's done. That's settled. I mean, I want to build this with you, for real, for as long as you'll have me." He looked at her directly. "I know I got here sideways. I know I lied, and I know you're not a person who forgets that. I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm asking you whether you think what we've built since then is worth building on." She looked at him for a long time. "You're asking if I want to marry you," she said. "I'm asking if you want to consider it," he said. "I'm not assuming." She looked out at the yard. The cottonwoods were full-leafed now, moving in the May night air with a sound that was nothing like the bare winter clicking. This was full and green and alive, the sound of a season that had arrived and intended to stay. "You're not the man who rode up that track in October," she said. "No," he said. "I'm not." "You're also not someone I know completely," she said. 7 months is 7 months. "That's true," he said. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. I have opinions about ventilation, and I keep the ledger in a way that not everyone would understand. And I don't stop working when I'm tired. I stop working when the work is done, which sometimes isn't the same thing." "I've noticed all of those things," he said. "None of them are problems." She was quiet. "Wyatt," she said. "Yes." "The night you put the deed on the table," she said. "When I was angry because it mattered. This place mattering is why it hurt, and you mattering is why the lying hurt." She turned to look at him. "I'm telling you that so you understand what I'm saying when I say yes." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, making sure he'd heard right. "Yes," she said. "I want to build on it. I want... yes." She said it a third time, not for him but for herself, the way you say something 3 times when you're deciding to let it be true. "Yes." He reached across the space between the chairs and took her hand, and she let him, and they sat on the porch of the house that had been a ruin and was now a home, in the dark that was full of the sounds of the ranch alive around them, and didn't speak for a while because there was nothing that needed saying. After a while she said, "Molly's going to be insufferable about this." "She'll be correct," he said. "That's what I mean," Abigail said. "Well, there are things you only understand when you've been lost long enough to know what finding is. Not the romantic kind of lost. Not the wandering and discovering variety that gets written up prettily. The real kind. The kind that's just absence and duration and the gradual erosion of the person you were before the worst thing happened. The kind where you look up one day and realize you've been gone so long you've forgotten what you were going toward." Wyatt Mercer had been that kind of lost for 5 years. He'd thought the answer was to outrun it. To put enough distance and enough work and enough forgettable towns between himself and the place where everything had gone wrong. That if he just kept moving, the weight of it would diminish with the miles. It doesn't work that way. The things that matter don't diminish with distance. They travel with you, packed tight, and they're exactly the same weight in New Mexico as they were in Colorado. And the only thing the running accomplishes is that you end up far away from the place where the answers are. The answers, if there are any, are in the specific. In the drainage ditch that needs clearing, and the child who has opinions about crows, and the woman who builds things from nothing and keeps the ledger in a way you don't entirely understand and says yes 3 times because she's decided to mean it. In the markers recut with a cold chisel on a January morning so the names are clear again. In the ground turned and planted and the smoke from the chimney and the sound of the ranch at night, breathing. He'd come back for a tax notice. He'd stayed for everything else. And the everything else had been here the whole time, waiting inside the grief he'd run from. The proof that the land didn't only hold what had been lost, it held what could be built. Those aren't the same thing, and they're not in competition. They live in the same ground. That's what the frontier teaches, if you're willing to learn it. Not that loss is temporary, or that hard things don't last. They do. Clara and James were in the ravine, and they would always be in the ravine, and that was not going to change, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. But grief doesn't have to be the only tenant of a place. Abigail had moved into his grief and turned the lights on and fed the cattle and made the ledger work, and somewhere in the course of all that practical, unglamorous, relentless living, she'd made the grief bearable not by diminishing it but by surrounding it with something else, with life, with Molly, and her chalk slate, and her opinions about symmetry, with coffee at the fence line and arguments about ventilation and the specific solid feeling of a fence post set right into the ground, tamped deep, built to hold through whatever weather comes. That was enough. That was, in the end, all of it. On the last morning of May, Wyatt woke before dawn as he always did, and lay in the quiet for a moment and listened to the ranch, the cattle beginning to shift, the creek running, somewhere a bird starting up its business in the cottonwoods, the sound of the house around him full and warm with sleep. He got up, put on his boots, went out to the barn. Trouble was in his stall, turning his head with the mild, experienced attention of a horse who has watched this man come and go for a long time. "Morning," Wyatt said. He checked the water, checked the feed, ran a hand along the horse's neck the way he always did, feeling the solid, living warmth of him. Then he leaned against the stall door and looked out the barn doorway at the yard in the early light, the frost-free ground, the pasture green for the first time since he'd arrived, the kitchen garden in its second season, the porch where they'd sat last night. The sun cleared the eastern ridge, and the light came across the ranch in that particular way it had in this specific place in this specific season. The angle of it, the quality, the way it found the dew on the grass and the window glass and the new fence posts and turned them all briefly, unremarkably, into something worth seeing. He'd watched the sun come up over this ground when he was 20. He'd watched it from the barn while his son slept and his wife kept the kitchen warm. He'd thought, in those mornings, that it was ordinary, that he'd have it forever, and it was ordinary. He knew better now. He stood in the barn doorway and watched the light move across the Mercer Ranch, across what it was and what it had been and what it was going to be. And let it be extraordinary. Let it be everything. Let it be, for the first time in 5 years, enough. The house door opened. Molly came out in her coat, buttoned wrong as always, ragdoll under her arm, heading for the barn with the unhurried certainty of a child who knows where she's going. She found him in the doorway and looked up at him with those old, clear eyes. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. She came and stood beside him in the doorway and looked out at the yard and the pasture and the smoke just beginning to rise from the chimney as her mother started the stove inside. "It's a good day," she said. He looked down at her, then out at the ranch. "Yeah," he said, "it is." And it was. Imperfect and cold-edged and full of work still waiting, and not a single easy thing about any of it, but real and present and theirs. That was the whole of it. That was enough.